The haunting mystery of the Cecil Hotel. The Cecil Hotel stood ominously in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. Its Gothic architecture a relic from a bygone era. Built in 1924, it had once been a lavish destination for travelers seeking the glamour of the city. But as the years wore on, the hotel's luster faded, replaced by a reputation that bordered on infamous. Beneath its grand facade, the Cecil hid a dark, troubling history, one that many believed had left an indelible mark on its very walls. From the 1930s onward, a series of grisly incidents earned the Cecil its nickname, the Hotel of Death. Suicides, murders, and unexplained disappearances became common. It was here that the notorious serial killer Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, stayed during his reign of terror in the 1980s. Another serial killer, Jack Unterweger, called it home while committing a string of murders in Los Angeles. The hotel seemed to attract darkness, as if it were a magnet for tragedy. But nothing captured the world's imagination quite like the story of Elisa Lam. Elisa Lam, a 21-year-old Canadian student, arrived in Los Angeles in January 2013. An adventurous spirit, she had planned a solo trip along the West Coast, documenting her journey on social media. Her posts were filled with excitement and curiosity, capturing snapshots of her travels and her thoughts about life. On January 26th, she checked into the Cecil Hotel. Initially, Elisa was placed in a shared room with other guests. However, after complaints of odd behavior, she was moved to a private room on the 4th floor. The last known footage of her, captured by the hotel's elevator security camera on January 31st, would later become one of the most chilling and widely debated videos on the internet. In the footage, Elisa appeared agitated, pressing multiple elevator buttons, peering nervously into the hallway, and making strange hand gestures. At times, it seemed as if she was speaking to someone unseen. Then, she stepped out of the elevator and disappeared from view. She was never seen alive again. When Elisa failed to check out on February 1st, her family grew worried. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department, who began an investigation. Flyers with Elisa's picture were distributed throughout the city. Detectives combed through hours of security footage, retracing her steps within the hotel. The Cecil's residents, a mix of tourists and long-term tenants, reported hearing strange noises in the nights following Elisa's disappearance. Some claimed to have seen a young woman matching her description wandering the hallways in a daze. While others dismissed it as urban legend, days turned into weeks, and hope began to dwindle. On February 19th, nearly 3 weeks after Elisa's disappearance, hotel guests began complaining about low water pressure and an unusual taste in the tap water. Maintenance workers were dispatched to the rooftop to inspect the water tanks. What they found was horrifying. Inside one of the tanks, floating lifelessly, was Elisa Lam's body. Her death was officially ruled an accidental drowning, but the circumstances surrounding it only deepened the mystery. The rooftop was locked and alarmed, making it nearly impossible for her to access it undetected. How had she ended up inside the water tank? Why had she acted so strangely in the elevator footage? The questions were endless, and the answers were few. The internet exploded with theories. Some believed Elisa had been the victim of foul play. Others suggested she had experienced a mental health crisis, pointing to her history of bipolar disorder. But the most chilling theories hinted at something far more sinister. The Cecil Hotel's dark past seemed almost like a character in the story, an entity that fed on tragedy. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed Elisa had fallen victim to the malevolent forces that haunted the building. They pointed to eerie coincidences, the similarities between her case and the plot of the 2005 horror film, Dark Water, the disturbing history of deaths in the hotel, and the mysterious behavior captured in the elevator footage. Despite exhaustive investigations, many questions remain unanswered to this day. The case of Elisa Lam continues to captivate true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators alike. Was it simply a tragic accident? Or was there something more at play? Was the Cecil Hotel merely a backdrop for an unfortunate event? Or was it somehow complicit in the tragedy? For those who visit the hotel today, the story of Elisa Lam serves as a haunting reminder of the mysteries that still linger within its walls. Some claim to feel an unexplainable heaviness when they stand near the water tanks. Others speak of seeing a shadowy figure near the elevator, a figure they swear looks just like Elisa. In the years following Elisa's death, numerous paranormal investigators and ghost hunters visited the Cecil Hotel, hoping to uncover the truth. Some brought sophisticated equipment, while others relied on intuition and experience with the supernatural. Several reported unexplained phenomena, cold spots, sudden battery drains in electronic devices, and disembodied voices caught on recording devices. One investigator claimed to have seen a spectral figure near the rooftop tanks during a nighttime investigation. It felt like someone was watching me. He later recounted, "When I turned around, I saw a woman standing by the tank. She vanished the moment I blinked." Others reported hearing Elisa's name whispered softly in the hallways. One team even captured a chilling EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, that seemed to say, "Help me." Years later, true crime enthusiasts continued to pore over the elevator footage, searching for hidden clues. Some believed that a second figure could be seen in the reflections of the elevator doors, a shadowy presence standing just out of sight. Theories about government conspiracies, secret experiments, and occult rituals swirled online, adding layers of complexity to an already baffling case. Several independent investigators raised questions about the official timeline and the police report. How had Elisa accessed the rooftop when the doors were supposed to be locked and alarmed? Why did no one hear her struggling in the water tank? And why was the hotel management so reluctant to cooperate with certain aspects of the investigation? Today, the Cecil Hotel is a part of urban legend, a place where reality and the supernatural blur. It has become a symbol of unanswered questions and unresolved mysteries. For those who dare to visit, the experience is unforgettable, a walk through the halls of a building steeped in tragedy and shadows. Though the hotel has undergone renovations and rebranding efforts, its dark legacy remains. Some believe that as long as the building stands, it will continue to attract the lost, the desperate, and the curious. Not all stories at the Cecil Hotel end in tragedy. Several former residents and guests have shared their own encounters with the unknown, adding new layers to the hotel's dark lore. One woman, who lived in the building for 6 months, spoke of nightly disturbances, doors slamming on their own, whispering voices outside her window, and a recurring nightmare of being pulled into a dark, watery abyss. "I never slept well there," she said in an interview. "It always felt like something was watching me, just waiting for the right moment to show itself." Another guest claimed to have experienced time lapses while staying at the Cecil. "I'd look at the clock, and hours would have passed in what felt like seconds. It's like the building itself was distorting reality." As the years pass, the story of Elisa Lam refuses to fade into obscurity. Documentaries, podcasts, and books continue to explore her mysterious death, each offering a different interpretation. For her family, however, the story is one of loss and unanswered questions, a painful reminder of a life cut tragically short. The Cecil Hotel remains a place of fascination, a location where the past and present collide. Whether it is truly haunted or simply a victim of circumstance, one thing is certain: its story will continue to be told for generations to come. The mystery of apartment 13. It was an overcast autumn afternoon when Emma unlocked the door to her new apartment in the heart of London. The building was old, its red brick facade worn with age. Yet, there was something charming about it, something that spoke of history and secrets. Her new home, apartment 13, was on the third floor of a building that had stood for more than a century. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but Emma found it comforting. It felt like a fresh start, a place where she could finally leave behind her troubled past. The landlord had been eager to rent it out, offering her a surprisingly low price for such a central location. He'd mentioned something about previous tenants not staying long, but Emma hadn't thought much of it. This place is perfect, she thought, walking through the small but cozy living room. Sunlight filtered weakly through the lace curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Her excitement dimmed slightly when she noticed how cold it was inside. Even with the windows closed, she shrugged it off, blaming the thick stone walls and the autumn chill. After all, old buildings had quirks. The first night was quiet. Emma unpacked a few boxes, made herself a cup of tea, and curled up on the sofa with a book. As the evening wore on, the wind outside picked up, howling softly through the narrow alleyways between buildings. It wasn't until she was in bed that she noticed something strange. At first, it was just a soft tapping sound, almost like rain, but it wasn't coming from outside. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. Emma sat up, her heart thudding. The sound stopped abruptly. She listened for a few more minutes, then convinced herself it must have been her imagination. But as she drifted back to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the odd occurrences continued. Lights flickered despite new bulbs. Doors that she was certain she'd closed were found ajar. One morning, she woke to find the lace curtains drawn back, though she distinctly remembered closing them the night before. Then there were the footsteps. They always came at the same time, 10:13 p.m., soft, deliberate steps that echoed through the hallway outside her door. Emma would hold her breath, waiting for them to pass, but they never did. Instead, they stopped right in front of her door, lingering for a moment before fading away. Her unease grew, but she tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the creaky old building settling, or maybe she had a neighbor who worked odd hours. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Curiosity soon got the better of her. Emma decided to visit the local library to research the history of her building. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. Apartment 13 had a dark past. In the late 1920s, a woman named Margaret Whitmore had lived there. Margaret had been a recluse, rarely seen by her neighbors. One night, after weeks of silence, her lifeless body was found in the apartment. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but rumors swirled about foul play. Over the years, several other tenants had reported strange occurrences. Most didn't stay longer than a few months. A few had even claimed to see Margaret's ghost, wandering the halls in a long, white nightgown. The footsteps returned that night, louder and more insistent. Emma sat in her living room, staring at the door, her pulse racing. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath misted in the air. A shadow moved just beyond the threshold. Emma froze, her eyes locked on the doorknob as it began to turn slowly. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The door creaked open a few inches. No one was there. Gathering her courage, Emma stepped into the hallway. The air felt thick, oppressive. She turned on her phone's flashlight and swept it across the dark corridor. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the far end, a woman in a long, white gown, her face pale and hollow. Emma stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. Her hands shook as she locked it, her heart hammering in her chest. The next morning, Emma called a local paranormal investigator. Simon Gray was a no-nonsense man in his late 40s with a reputation for solving unexplained phenomena. After listening to Emma's story, Simon agreed to investigate. He brought along equipment, EMF meters, thermal cameras, and recording devices. As they walked through the apartment, Simon's expression grew more serious. "There's definitely something here," he said, checking the EMF meter, which spiked near the doorway. It's not uncommon for spirits to linger in places with unresolved trauma. That night, they conducted a seance. The room was bathed in candlelight as Simon called out to any spirits present. The air grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. Then, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, filled the room. "Help me." Through the seance, they discovered that Margaret's spirit was trapped, unable to move on. She had not taken her own life but had been the victim of a violent crime. Her killer had never been caught, and her soul remained bound to the apartment, seeking justice. Simon promised to help her find peace. Over the next few days, he conducted rituals to cleanse the space. Gradually, the disturbances lessened, the footsteps stopped, the air felt lighter. On the final night, Emma had a dream. Margaret stood at the foot of her bed, smiling softly. "Thank you," she said, her voice like a breeze. Then she faded away. The apartment felt different after that. Warmth returned to its rooms, and the oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone. Emma decided to stay, feeling a strange connection to the place. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye, a shadow, a fleeting figure, but it no longer frightened her. Margaret was at peace, and so was Emma. A few weeks later, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawkins knocked on Emma's door. She introduced herself as a former tenant of the building. "I just wanted to check in on you, dear," she said with a kind smile. "Apartment 13 has a history." Emma invited her in, and over a cup of tea, Mrs. Hawkins shared her own experiences. Margaret wasn't the only one, she revealed. There were others, people who disappeared, accidents that couldn't be explained. "This place has always had a dark presence." Emma listened intently, her unease growing. Although Margaret was at peace, something told her the story of Apartment 13 wasn't over yet. Emma began documenting her experiences, determined to uncover the full truth about Apartment 13. She interviewed former tenants, researched old newspapers, and delved into archives. What she discovered was even more disturbing than she imagined. The building had been the site of multiple unexplained deaths over the past century. Each incident seemed to be connected, as if the building itself were cursed. One evening, as she sat writing in her journal, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop at her door. They entered the room. Emma turned slowly, her heart pounding. A figure stood in the shadows, its face hidden but its presence undeniable. The story of Apartment 13 wasn't over, and Emma realized it never would be. The haunting of the abandoned church. It was a crisp October evening in the quiet rural town of Maple Hollow, Alabama. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as a group of teenagers gathered around a bonfire near the edge of the woods. The flickering flames danced across their faces, illuminating their mischievous grins. "I dare you to spend the night in the old St. Mary's Church," said Chris, his voice low and dramatic. Everyone knew about St. Mary's. The church had stood abandoned for decades, a crumbling relic of a forgotten past. Rumors swirled around the place, stories of ghostly figures, strange noises, and shadows that moved on their own. It was the kind of place that dared you to believe in the supernatural. The group fell silent, waiting for someone to accept the challenge. Finally, Emma spoke up. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Chris smirked. "All right, Emma, but you'll need proof. Bring back something from inside, something we can recognize." Emma nodded, determined not to back down. "Deal." St. Mary's Church stood at the end of a long, winding dirt road. Its once white exterior was now gray and peeling, the steeple leaning slightly to one side. Broken stained glass windows stared out like empty eyes, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges. Emma parked her car at the edge of the property and stepped out. Flashlight in hand, the wind whispered through the surrounding trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. "It's just an old building," she told herself, trying to steady her nerves. The heavy wooden door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and the altar stood in shadows at the far end of the room. Emma's footsteps echoed as she made her way down the center aisle. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, illuminating faded religious murals and cobweb-covered statues. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Emma was halfway down the aisle when she heard it, a soft whispering. Barely audible, she froze, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. Emma swept her flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. She took a deep breath and continued walking, convincing herself it was just the wind. Then she heard it again, this time louder, more distinct. The whispering seemed to come from the direction of the altar. Emma hesitated, her pulse racing, but her curiosity pushed her forward. As she approached the altar, the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stood in front of the altar, her flashlight illuminating an old, dust-covered Bible. She reached out and picked it up, turning its brittle pages. Suddenly, the air around her grew colder. A chill ran down her spine, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a shadow moving across the wall. It moved quickly, disappearing into the darkness behind the altar. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. Slowly, she stepped around the side of the altar, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. Emma tried to steady her breathing, but the sense of unease lingered. She decided it was time to leave. Clutching the old Bible as proof of her visit, she made her way back down the aisle. That's when she saw the figure. Standing at the back of the church, partially hidden in the shadows, was a tall figure cloaked in black. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable. Emma's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. Without waiting for an answer, Emma turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty church. She burst through the front door and didn't stop running until she reached her car. The next day, Emma couldn't shake the events of the previous night. Determined to find out more, she visited the town's historical society. An elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson greeted her with a warm smile. "What can I help you with, dear?" "I want to know about St. Mary's Church," Emma said. "It's history, anything you can tell me." Mrs. Thompson's smile faded. "Ah, St. Mary's. That place has quite the reputation." She explained that the church had been abandoned in the late 1940s after a series of mysterious incidents. Several parishioners had reported seeing shadowy figures and hearing strange noises during services. The final straw came when the pastor, Father John, disappeared without a trace. Some say he was taken by something, not of this world, Mrs. Thompson said, lowering her voice. Others believe he's still there, watching over the church. Despite her fear, Emma knew she had to go back. She needed to know the truth. Armed with a camera and a digital recorder, she returned to St. Mary's that evening. The church was even more foreboding in the fading light. Emma stepped inside, her footsteps echoing once again. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the floorboards making her jump. She set up her camera near the altar and began recording. "If there's anyone here, please show yourself," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the whispering began again. This time, it was unmistakable. Emma turned toward the sound, her camera capturing every moment. The shadowy figure appeared once more, standing at the back of the church. Slowly, it began to move toward her. "What do you want?" Emma demanded, her voice rising in panic. The figure stopped just a few feet away. For the first time, Emma could make out its face, pale and hollow. its eyes filled with an unsettling darkness. "Help me," it whispered. Emma's fear gave way to a surge of determination. "Who are you? How can I help you?" The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the altar. Emma followed its gaze and saw something she hadn't noticed before, a trapdoor partially hidden beneath a broken pew. Emma pushed aside the pew and pried open the trapdoor. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Taking a deep breath, she climbed down, her flashlight illuminating the stone walls. At the bottom, she found a small, hidden chamber. In the center of the room was an old trunk. Emma hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling. Inside were old church records, photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Father John. Emma flipped through its pages, her eyes widening as she read the entries. Father John had documented everything, the strange occurrences, the shadowy figures, and his growing fear that something evil had taken root in the church. Emma brought the journal back upstairs, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had discovered. She placed it on the altar and whispered a silent prayer. The church seemed to exhale, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The shadowy figure appeared one last time, its expression softer, almost grateful. "Thank you," it whispered before fading into the darkness. Emma knew she had done what Father John could not. She had uncovered the truth and helped a restless spirit find peace. As she left St. Mary's for the last time, the wind carried a sense of closure. The church stood silent and still, its secrets finally laid to rest. But Emma knew she would never forget the haunting of St. Mary's Church. The supernatural phenomena at Waverly Hills. The sky was overcast as Sarah pulled her car into the cracked and crumbling parking lot of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Perched on a hill overlooking Louisville, Kentucky, the imposing structure loomed like a monolith of the past. Its dark windows seemed to stare back at her, almost alive with secrets waiting to be unearthed. Sarah shivered, despite the warmth of the late summer air. "Are you sure you want to do this?" her friend Jake asked, adjusting the camera in his hands. Sarah nodded, determined. "I've done haunted locations before, but this one's different. They say it's one of the most haunted places in America. We had to document it." Waverly Hills had gained infamy over the years. Once a state-of-the-art tuberculosis hospital in the early 20th century, it had seen thousands of deaths during the height of the epidemic. Over time, tales of ghostly apparitions, shadow people, and disembodied voices had turned it into a hotspot for paranormal investigators. Before stepping inside, Sarah took a moment to reflect on the history of Waverly Hills. Built in 1910, the sanatorium initially opened as a small facility to treat tuberculosis patients. As the disease spread, the hospital expanded, eventually accommodating over 400 patients at a time. The treatments were brutal by today's standards. Pneumothorax procedures, rib removals, and exposure to extreme cold were common practices. Many patients didn't survive, their bodies taken away through the infamous body chute, a long tunnel designed to discreetly transport the dead out of sight from the living. Rumors of inhumane experiments and patient mistreatment further darkened Waverly Hills' legacy. When the hospital closed in 1961, it became a focal point for ghost stories and local legends. The main entrance groaned as Sarah and Jake pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through broken windows. The air smelled of mildew and decay. "This place is straight out of a horror movie," Jake muttered, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hallway. Sarah took out her recorder. "Let's start in the main ward and work our way up." They had barely begun their exploration when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing from the floor above. Jake froze, his camera trained on the ceiling. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening. "It's probably just the building settling," she said, though she wasn't entirely convinced. They continued down the hallway, but the sense of being watched never left them. As they made their way to the second floor, Sarah felt the temperature drop sharply. Her breath misted in the air. "This is weird," she said, checking her EMF meter. The device spiked suddenly, its lights flashing red. Jake panned his camera around the room, and that's when they saw it, a shadowy figure darting across the hallway. "What was that?" Jake exclaimed, rushing to the spot where the figure had been. But there was nothing there. Sarah reviewed the footage on their camera. The figure was clearly visible, a dark silhouette moving with unnatural speed. "That's definitely not a trick of the light," she said, her voice trembling. Determined to press on, they headed to the fourth floor, home to the infamous children's ward. Legend had it that the ghost of a little boy named Timmy liked to play with visitors. Many had reported seeing a ball rolling across the floor on its own. Jake set a red rubber ball in the middle of the hallway. "If anyone's here, you can play with the ball," he called out. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly and deliberately, the ball began to roll. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Jake, did you see that?" "Yeah," Jake whispered, his camera trained on the ball. "I'm getting this on film." The ball rolled to a stop against the wall, then moved back toward them as if pushed by an unseen hand. The tension grew as they moved deeper into the sanatorium. Sarah kept her recorder running, hoping to capture EVP's electronic voice phenomena. "Can you tell us your name?" she asked, her voice echoing in the empty hallway. At first, there was only silence. Then, a faint whisper came through the recorder. "Help me." Sarah and Jake exchanged nervous glances. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, replaying the recording. The voice was clear, almost pleading. "Let's keep going," Jake said, though his hands were trembling. No exploration of Waverly Hills would be complete without a visit to the infamous body chute. The tunnel stretched nearly 500 feet down the hill, once used to transport the deceased to waiting hearses below. The air grew colder as they descended. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, blending with the rhythmic drip of water from the ceiling. "This place is seriously creepy," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Halfway down, they heard it, a low moaning sound that seemed to come from the darkness ahead. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. The moaning stopped, replaced by a soft, sinister laugh. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, turning back toward the entrance. Back in the main building, Sarah and Jake decided to wrap up their investigation. But as they prepared to leave, the building seemed to come alive around them. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the temperature dropped to near freezing. "Something doesn't want us to leave," Sarah said, clutching her recorder. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. They sprinted down the hallway, the figure pursuing them with inhuman speed. They burst through the front doors, gasping for breath. Back at their hotel, Sarah and Jake reviewed the footage. The evidence was undeniable: shadow figures, disembodied voices, and physical manifestations. They had captured proof of something truly supernatural. "We need to share this," Sarah said, uploading the footage to her laptop. The video went viral within days, sparking renewed interest in Waverly Hills. Despite their terrifying experience, Sarah felt a strange sense of fulfillment. She had gone seeking proof and found more than she ever expected. Waverly Hills remained as mysterious as ever, its dark corridors still whispering secrets to those brave enough to listen. But Sarah knew one thing for certain: some places are haunted not just by spirits, but by the weight of history itself.